We just heard discussions about our individual personal privacy, and we're going to expand out a little bit to really talking about the idea of going now to a digital person, and really specifically how the NTT Research Medical and Health Informatics Lab is developing digital twins really in terms of all of it, how we're operating. And you heard Joe talking a little bit about that. And I'd like to introduce Iris Shelly to you, who's going to share some information along those lines. Iris, please join us on stage.
Thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. To get started, I'd like to ask each of you to think back to your last experience with the healthcare system. Maybe you were dealing with an illness or an injury, or it's just time for a regular checkup, but chances are that most of you went into a clinic or a hospital to see your doctor. At this point, they might have asked you about your symptoms, conducted a physical exam, and hopefully looked over your medical chart before recommending some sort of treatment plan. Now, in your medical chart, they should have had access to a lot of your health history, including things like records from prior visits, maybe your reactions to previous treatments. But ultimately, it was up to your doctor to read through all of this information and use these disparate data to inform your care. And some of your potentially relevant data might not have been available to them at all. For example, if you have a smartwatch that's monitoring your heart rate or maybe tracking your activity and your sleep. Now, as we've seen, particularly over the past few years, this system places a heavy burden on medical professionals, and it's vulnerable to becoming overwhelmed if too many patients need care at the same time. While your treatment team has access to a lot of your data, in reality, it often just isn't feasible to read through your full history during a quick appointment. And as a result, your physician is fundamentally only seeing a snapshot in time of your condition when you visit their office. But what if instead they had an easier way to make recommendations based on all of your available data, not just from today, but from throughout your life? Your health data already exist in a digital space, so why not take this next step and use these data to create a more holistic digital representation of you? Rather than relying on one person to read through a lifetime's worth of accumulated data while you're sitting there waiting for treatment, let's leverage technology and the best available research to make your treatment more efficient and more effective. In this paradigm, your doctor would have access not only to a more comprehensive summary of your health, but actually to a testable digital platform where they could do things like try out different treatments before writing a single prescription. They could make predictions about your future health without waiting for new symptoms to arise. And all of this without the risk, time, and expense of prescribing you different options and waiting to see how your physical body responds. This future builds personalized healthcare and precision medicine into the system to better support not just acute care and disease management, but also prevention and wellness. At NTT Research, the Medical and Health Informatics Laboratory is working towards this future through development of the Cardiovascular Bio Digital Twin. Why cardiovascular, you might ask? Well, if we look at the top 10 causes of death worldwide, where a new approach to healthcare could really have the biggest impact, cardiovascular disease stands out, with ischemic heart disease and stroke together making up almost half of all deaths amongst these top 10 causes. And even if you feel healthy today, nearly half of all Americans have at least one key risk factor for heart disease. So rather than wait to play those odds, what if we could make personalized recommendations for lifestyle changes or early interventions to help keep you healthier for longer? And for those who do still become sick, the same technologies would facilitate better care to improve outcomes and reduce hospitalizations. Our Cardiovascular Bio Digital Twin project is a way to combine decades of basic scientific research with an individual's own clinical data to help physicians provide this personalized care. But how can we make this feasible to implement? Given this expansive reach of cardiovascular disease, it's not enough if only the lucky few with access to top cardiologists can hope to benefit. We need an approach that scales easily to any number of patients and that can flexibly combine a variety of different data types, collected at different times and in different clinical or even non-clinical settings. And in working towards this goal, our foundation is a mechanistic model of the cardiovascular system. Essentially, your heart is a mechanical pump, and it pushes blood through several valves and a series of pipes, your vasculature, to circulate this blood throughout the rest of your body. Thanks to this basis in fluid mechanics, we can use some relatively simple equations to model this basic blood flow or hemodynamics. However, we of course know that the human body is quite complex, and it has remarkable ways to self-regulate and respond to a variety of internal and external changes. So to capture some of these interactions, we're layering other body systems on top of our basic hemodynamic framework. For example, we're adding the autonomic nervous system, which helps you do things like maintain a stable blood pressure or increase your heart rate to deliver more oxygen to your muscles during exercise. We're adding the kidneys to provide the renal system's interaction with blood and fluid volumes. And we're adding the lungs to provide oxygenation of the blood. Having all of these different layers not only makes our model more true to physiology, but it lets us simulate things like different drug treatments, where the drugs may act directly on the heart or the vasculature, or they may act on one or more of these other interconnected systems. But taking all of these components together, we can achieve a dynamic simulation of blood flowing throughout the human body, like we've been watching in the display on the right. And this includes visibility into a variety of clinically relevant output measurements, including things like heart rate, the pressures and flows within the heart, and the blood pressure seen by the rest of the body. However, our goal isn't just to create the single simulation representing a generic cardiovascular system, but rather to create each individual's digital twin. And to do this, we need some way to tune our model for a specific patient. However, each of the relationships within our model may be the result of years or decades of scientific research, and we can't reproduce all of those studies for each current patient. And while our model is mechanistically grounded in actual physiology, we also can't just directly measure these internal parameter values in a patient. They simply aren't accessible through those sorts of direct clinical measurements. So how can we make the transition from our single model framework to an individual patient's digital twin? We need some way to use the clinical data we do have in combination with our model to tune it to a patient's unique physiology. And to do this, we're working with a group called Embody Bio. They've built a unique software platform centered on Bayesian statistics, and it lets us flexibly combine our basic model framework with prior population-level knowledge and an individual patient's clinical data to determine that patient's digital twin. So in making this transition from model to twin, our first step is to build up a large digital population by running our model for a range of different internal parameter values. So these internal parameter values are our hypotheses. They're basically our best guess at the range of physiological values we could see in the real population. Then we know that the cardiovascular system depends not only on these internal variables, but also on a variety of external factors or contexts. Things like your current activity. Are you sitting down calmly or are you standing up moving around? Maybe you took a medication to control your blood pressure or even just drank a bunch of coffee and increased your heart rate. But considering all of these internal and external variables together, we can run our model and collect the simulation outputs. And these become the predicted measurements for each member of our digital population. Then once we've built up this digital population, we can start to consider the individual patient. So this patient may have measurements available collected at different times and during different activities or contexts. And then there's also going to be some uncertainty on top of all of this. Measurements are always subject to errors, and even with perfect equipment and perfect techniques, biological measurements still vary minute to minute or even heartbeat to heartbeat. And the observed context also isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. In reality, there are all sorts of external factors acting on each of us at any given moment, and they can't be perfectly characterized. However, Embody Bio lets us use statistical approaches to represent not only the measurements in the context, but also these associated uncertainties. It then uses these probabilistic representations of the data, along with a statistical technique called Bayesian inference, to basically find which of our original hypotheses are most likely to explain our current observations. This step basically compares our observed measurements against the full population's predicted measurements to find some subset of that population best matching the current patient. There's still going to be some uncertainty even at the output of this step. You won't be perfectly represented by just one value for each parameter. You'll be represented by some range of values. But this output, this distribution of hypotheses, is the biodigital twin. Finally, now that we have this twin, what can we actually do with it? We want to use it not just to look at the patient's current condition, but to make predictions. And as we enter this predictive realm, we've basically refined the hypotheses that we'll use as the input to our model. So rather than having our best guess at the full digital population, we have our twin, our evidence-based set of hypotheses for the specific patient. And then rather than just looking at the patient's current context, we can project their twin forward into a variety of different what-if contexts, things like different drug treatments or aging. Embody Bio then lets us use our digital twin as a testable platform by leveraging Bayesian analytics to make patient-specific measurement predictions in each of these different contexts. Okay, so now we've seen a lot of concepts, but this probably still feels pretty abstract. So how might this actually work in practice? First, let's take a look at our full digital population, specifically visualizing aortic pressure measurements. So this is a blood pressure waveform that would often be measured in acute care settings, but even during a regular office visit, you're probably very familiar with it being recorded just in terms of a systolic or peak value over a diastolic or trough value, something like 120/80. So within our digital population, we have virtual individuals with a range of these pressure waveforms. We, of course, have normal healthy individuals with that typical 120/80 measurement like this, but we also have virtual individuals with hypertension or high blood pressure and with hypotension or low blood pressure. But now that we've built up the digital population, let's say that a patient comes into the clinic with hypertension. His blood pressure is much higher than it should be, and his doctor needs to find some way to lower it. So we would use these pressure measurements, apply them against our digital population to find the patient's digital twin. And if we look at the twin's predicted measurements in the current clinical context, we can see that they nicely match up with our observations, just like what we would expect. But the interesting part isn't confirming the patient's current condition, which we basically already know, but rather making predictions about how he might respond to a variety of different treatments. And this is important because in clinical practice, there are many available drugs to treat hypertension, but they may affect different patients in different ways. And on top of that, for each of those drugs, there may be a range of possible dosages without there necessarily being a clear rule to select the best one. So with that motivation, let's start trying out some treatments. So a first option we select is something that we would expect to be effective for many patients, but for this particular patient, the digital twin predicts it'll have very little impact, with predicted pressure measurements remaining quite high. Okay, so let's move on to a second choice. The second option, again, would be consistent with standard clinical guidelines, and this time the twin predicts it will have some effect on blood pressure, but it looks like it may fail to adequately manage that high systolic peak pressure measurement before lowering the diastolic or trough measurement too much. So this probably isn't going to be our best option. Now, without the digital twin, these two unsuccessful treatment options could have cost weeks or months in the patient's journey to better health, potentially adding uncomfortable side effects, not to mention the financial cost of the drugs themselves and just the negative health impacts of persistent high blood pressure. However, thanks to the digital twin, the doctor knows almost immediately to move on and try a third option. This third option successfully moves the twin's predicted pressure measurements into the healthy range, so the doctor can more confidently move forward and recommend this treatment to their physical patient, skipping over all of that trial and error and jumping straight to a personalized recommendation. So this shows how the biodigital twin can help a patient who's already sick, but what about a patient who's currently healthy? In this case, we can start back with that same digital population, but this time we'll observe a healthy patient who comes into the clinic with good blood pressure. We can use these pressure measurements, apply them against the digital population to find her currently healthy biodigital twin. Now, I say currently healthy because we know that certain changes tend to occur with aging that make cardiovascular disease more likely over time. So for example, as you get older, your arteries tend to get stiffer, which can increase your blood pressure. We can use this population level knowledge to essentially fast forward the patient's twin to a point a few years in the future, when we predict that her blood pressure may start to become slightly elevated. If we continue this process and fast forward her twin a few more years in the future, unfortunately we predict that her blood pressure may become dangerously high. However, just because we've made these predictions doesn't mean that the outcome is inevitable. Because just like we know that aging tends to have certain negative impacts on cardiovascular health, we also know that different lifestyle changes, like regular physical activity, can help to counteract these changes. We can use this knowledge and the patient's digital twin to make a personalized recommendation to help keep her healthy for as long as possible and we can recommend a custom schedule of follow-ups to check in and continue to refine her biodigital twin and its predictions. And this is really a key part of our longer-term vision for the future of this project. We're initially targeting acute care scenarios because these situations have a good availability of high-quality data, and the biodigital twin can have a real short-term benefit on the health of these patients. However, as we move forward into longitudinal monitoring of a patient over time, these digital twins can age and evolve just like their physical counterparts do. And with an ultimate goal of early disease detection and promotion of wellness, the Cardiovascular Bio Digital Twin can reach larger populations to truly upgrade healthcare. Thank you so much.